It all began with a phone call, one of those sudden, inconvenient interruptions that seem to come exactly when you're not ready for them. I was lounging on the couch, barely paying attention to some forgettable crime show playing in the background, when my phone started buzzing on the coffee table. Rachel's name lit up the screen. That, in itself, wasn't strange. What was strange, though, was the timing. She was supposed to be at the office, finalizing a big presentation for a client. So why was she calling? Curious and slightly concerned, I answered, half expecting a sweet voicemail or a quick message about dinner plans. What I got instead was her voice, tight, deliberate, almost robotic. "Hey, Jack. We need to talk," she said. That phrase had a history. The last time I heard it from her, we'd wound up in couples counseling because she accused me of being emotionally distant or something along those lines. But this time, her voice held something new, an underlying tremble, a nervousness she didn't bother to hide. Immediately, my instincts went on high alert. I sat up, all senses engaged. "Then let's talk," I said, ready to hear whatever it was. But she hesitated. "Not like this. Not over the phone," she insisted. I could hear her breathing, uneven, shaky. Then, before I could say another word, she hung up. The hours that followed were agonizing. My thoughts spiraled, crafting all sorts of worst-case scenarios. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what unfolded that night. Rachel walked through the front door just after 8. But she wasn't alone. A man came in right behind her, someone I'd never seen before. He looked to be in his late 30s, dressed in a suit that seemed pulled from a time capsule of outdated office fashion. Rachel wouldn't even meet my eyes. The man, awkward and visibly uncomfortable, hovered by the doorway like he'd rather vanish. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice tight as my pulse quickened. The man looked like he was about to speak, but Rachel stepped in, cutting him off and finally locking eyes with me. Her stare was chilling, firm and emotionless. "This is David. He's the man I've been seeing." It felt like the floor dropped out beneath me. The air in the room seemed to thin out all at once. She had said it without hesitation, completely devoid of emotion. My first impulse was to laugh. Maybe it was some cruel prank, but no punchline followed. David stood frozen, hands buried in his pockets, while Rachel kept that blank expression, offering no apology. "Wait, what?" I managed to choke out. A tangled knot of disbelief, rage, and confusion built in my chest. But Rachel didn't react. She continued, calm and composed. "We've been involved for about a year now," she admitted, and suddenly everything began to click into place. The late nights, the distant attitude, the random new acquaintances, her sudden obsession with looking perfect. All the signs had been there, and I had missed every one of them. David finally lifted his gaze. What I saw in his eyes wasn't remorse. It was pity. That was what finally sent me over the edge. "Get out of my house," I snapped, stepping forward. David flinched, clearly startled. I half expected him to bolt. Rachel quickly stepped between us, her body tense and her expression hardened. "Jack, just stop. Please. This isn't about you losing your temper," she said, glancing back at David. "He's staying. We need to talk." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. "He's staying?" I nearly shouted, fury rising like a tide. "You bring the guy you've been cheating with into our home, and now he's just staying here like it's nothing?" My hand trembled as I pointed at him. "Get out. Right now." Rachel pressed her palm against my chest. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was meant to stop me, to hold me back. Her tone was cool, almost emotionless. "You don't get to decide that anymore, Jack. You're not in control here." Those words hit me like a physical blow. In an instant, everything I thought I understood shifted. The woman standing before me was not the same person I thought I had built a life with. She was distant, deliberate, and clearly finished with whatever we had. David finally turned away, muttering something under his breath before slipping out the door like a ghost. And then it was just me and Rachel, alone in the wreckage of what used to be our life. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She sighed, running a hand through her hair without looking at me. "Do you really want the truth? Because the truth is this. Us. It stopped being enough for me a long time ago. And David, he's what I need now." Her words lingered in the air, slicing through me with precision. I stood there, frozen, my chest hollow, and my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rachel's voice, her words, they echoed like a relentless drumbeat. They were cold, detached, final. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Every part of me wanted to explode, to scream, to cry out, to rewind time and erase the nightmare that had unfolded before me. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, staring at the woman I thought I knew. Only now, she felt like a complete stranger. My throat tightened painfully as I managed to speak, the words cutting into me like jagged glass. How long has this been going on, Rachel? How long have you been involved with him? I wasn't just asking for the sake of knowing. I needed answers, anything that might help make sense of the chaos unraveling before me. Rachel let out a dramatic sigh, her eyes drifting upward in clear irritation, like the conversation was just another item on her to-do list. I've already told you, she replied with exasperation. It's been about a year. Jack, can we not do this whole emotional performance right now? You asked. I answered. That's it. A year. 12 entire months. That meant while we were on that getaway meant to heal us, she was already stepping out behind my back. While I was preparing her favorite dishes, trying to reignite our connection, she was with him. I had been planning our future, thinking about settling down and starting a family, all while she had emotionally checked out. The realization was crushing, like watching more than a decade of shared life shatter in an instant. Something inside me cracked. It wasn't just anger coursing through me anymore. It was pure, uncontrollable fury. My arm moved on instinct, knocking a vase off the kitchen counter. It crashed onto the tiled floor, breaking into countless pieces. Rachel instinctively flinched, a flicker of fear flashing across her features, though she quickly returned to that cold, unaffected demeanor. Are you finished? She asked, her voice as sharp and frigid as ice, her stare locked onto mine. Without a second thought, she stepped over the shards, completely unfazed, as if the mess was no more than a minor inconvenience. No, Rachel. I'm not finished, I said, each word weighted with pain. You show up here with him, tell me you're in love, and then what? Expect me to just accept it? Let him wait in the next room while we talk like this is normal? I let out a dry, bitter laugh. What kind of person thinks that's okay? What happened to the woman I knew? She shook her head slowly, almost like she felt sorry for me. You really don't get it, do you? I called you today because I wanted you to hear it from me before it spread elsewhere. David's wife found out. That's why I had to bring him here. David's wife. The words left a bitter taste in my mouth. So not only had she betrayed me, but he had betrayed someone too. Another marriage destroyed. With every new piece of this puzzle, things only got worse. So you're the other woman too, I said, disbelief crashing over me. You're both throwing away families and years of commitment? For what, Rachel? Some kind of thrill. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, her expression hardening. Don't make me out to be the villain. You were never really present, Jack. You buried yourself in work and left me to figure things out alone. I needed something more than you were offering. David gets me in a way you never could. And yes, he's married or was. That part's ending soon. This isn't just some random thing. I stepped back, my pulse pounding. The fury I felt was now mixed with a cold heaviness, like my soul was sinking. So this is it then? You're running because things got hard, because it got too real. Rachel laughed, but it was unlike any laugh I'd heard from her before. It lacked warmth. It was hollow, mocking almost. Maybe that's true. Or maybe I just realized I deserved to be happy. And I don't regret it. I could barely comprehend what I was hearing. There was no remorse in her voice, no sadness in her eyes. Not even a hint that she recognized how much she had broken. In her mind, she was justified. And I was just the clueless one left behind. Just then, the front door creaked open. David walked back inside, his eyes immediately landing on the broken vase and the suffocating tension that filled the room. He looked between us, hesitated, then spoke quietly. Is this a bad time? Rachel turned to him, and just like that, I ceased to exist in her world. Her expression softened as she looked at him, a look I hadn't seen directed at me in years. No, it's okay, she said in a gentle tone, stepping toward him. She placed her hand on his arm with such familiarity, as though they had always been together. Like I was just some distant memory. Something in me broke completely at that moment. Seeing her like that with him, in our home, surrounded by the pieces of our life now lying in ruins, it wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. She wasn't just leaving me. She was rewriting everything we had, pretending it never mattered. I reached for my keys on the table, the cold metal digging into my skin as I gripped them. I turned without looking back. I couldn't stay there, not even for another second. I'm leaving, I said, my voice trembling but firm, and when I return, I want both of you gone. Do you hear me, Rachel? I want you out of this house. She said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on David, like he was the only one that mattered now, and in that moment, I finally understood everything I needed to know. I slammed the door behind me, the echo bouncing down the silent hallway like a final note. I had no clue where I was heading, no route, no destination. But one thing had become painfully clear. Something had ended. Us. The version of myself I once recognized. And maybe, buried in the wreckage, there was a new beginning taking shape. A beginning where I could finally see her for who she truly was, not who I had imagined her to be. That night, I just drove. Hours slipped by, swallowed up by the endless road, the headlights stretching ahead like a path that refused to give answers. The engine's steady hum was the only thing breaking the quiet, while my thoughts spiraled endlessly. I wasn't chasing anything. I was escaping. Rachel's detached words, the shock of David standing inside my home, it all replayed on a relentless loop I couldn't shut off. Eventually, I pulled into a vacant parking lot on the outskirts of town, next to a line of shuttered stores and a lonely diner bathed in darkness. The engine died with a quiet click, and silence fell over me once more. The stillness wrapped around me like a thick blanket, pressing in. I had kept the breakdown at bay for as long as I could, but now, sitting alone in the night, the dam broke. Tears welled up and slid down my cheeks without warning, scalding as they fell. I slammed both fists against the steering wheel, the sharp sting grounding me. How could she? How could Rachel, with the same eyes that once held nothing but warmth and tenderness, now look at me as if I meant absolutely nothing? How could she reduce everything we had, the life we built, into a meaningless lie? My scream tore from my throat, loud yet muffled by the closed car windows. It didn't matter. There was no one around to hear anyway. Then my phone lit up on the passenger seat, vibrating with a new notification. I barely glanced at it, expecting some junk message, but froze the second I saw the name. It wasn't spam. It was Stacy, Rachel's best friend. The same Stacy who had called just the day before, her voice hesitant, like she had been right on the edge of revealing something crucial but hadn't quite found the courage. Jack, I need to talk to you. I know about David. Please call me. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I read her message again, the screen blurring slightly. I didn't hesitate. My hands were still shaking as I dialed her number. It rang a few times before she finally picked up. Jack, she said softly, her tone a mix of nervousness and relief. I wasn't sure you'd answer. Stacy, what's happening? I got straight to the point, my voice raw. You called me yesterday. You knew something. You knew about David. Just tell me everything. She hesitated, a heavy pause stretching between us. I could almost hear her debating with herself. Finally, she spoke, barely above a whisper. Rachel hasn't been honest with you, Jack. I tried to stay out of it, but I can't anymore. It's not just David. She's been planning to leave you for a long time now. She was waiting for the moment that suited her best, when everything lined up. Her words hit me like a splash of freezing water, jolting me out of the haze. Waiting for what to be convenient? I asked, my voice full of disbelief. For David to leave his wife, Stacy replied, her voice breaking slightly. She didn't want to make any moves until she was sure he was serious. But Jack, there's more. A lot more. I could hear her swallow hard on the other end before she continued. That's why David's wife called me. That's why I reached out to you. Rachel's done this before. My hand tightened around the phone, my knuckles pale. What do you mean? I barely got the words out, struggling to process. 7 years ago, Stacy said quietly, Rachel had an affair with another married man. His wife found out and contacted me, completely shattered. I brushed it off at the time, thought maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But now, watching how she's been with David, it all clicks into place. Her voice shook as she continued, as if the truth still stunned her. Jack, she didn't change. She just found a new person to chase. It's like a pattern with her. My whole body went numb. 7 years ago. That was when the first cracks in our relationship began to show. I told myself it was the pressure from work, or maybe just the natural ebb and flow of long-term love. I never even considered the possibility that Rachel had been hiding something so dark from me all along. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked quietly, the words barely audible. Because she's my friend, Stacy said with a deep sigh. I thought she had grown past all of that. I really believed she wanted something genuine with you. But I can't keep covering for her. Not now. Not after what I've seen. You deserve to know the truth. I didn't say anything. I simply ended the call. The phone slipped from my grasp and landed beside me on the seat. My mind reeled. 7 years of deception, manipulation, of being treated like a backup plan while she chased something else. And David? He was far from the beginning. The air inside the car grew too heavy to breathe. I shoved the door open and stepped out into the biting cold, desperate to feel anything but the crushing weight of betrayal. The night sky sparkled with stars, scattered like silent spectators, showing no sympathy for the turmoil inside me. I leaned my head back, gazing upward, caught in a spiral of thoughts. How many more lies had Rachel hidden from me? How much of the life I thought we shared was just an illusion? Then, as if a switch had flipped, something inside me began to shift. The sorrow, the fury, the sense of betrayal, they merged into something more focused, something with an edge. I wasn't going to allow her to continue manipulating me. I refused to be the clueless one left behind, stuck in the shadows of her deception while she juggled another life. Reaching for my phone, I scrolled through my contact list with a determination I hadn't felt all day. I didn't need comfort, and I wasn't looking for reassurance from Stacy or a therapist. I was searching for honesty from someone who had lived through the same nightmare, David's wife. After a few rings, a tired and fragile voice picked up the call. Hello. Hi, this is Jack, Rachel's husband. I think it's time we talked. There was a brief silence, followed by a deep exhale that spoke volumes of unspoken grief. Yes, she replied quietly. I think we do. The following day, I met David's wife, whose name was Linda, in a modest little cafe on the outskirts of town. During the drive, my mind raced with endless possibilities, how she might respond, what she might look like, how we would even begin such a painful conversation. But none of my mental rehearsals prepared me for what I saw when I arrived. Linda was already seated by the window, a nearly finished cup of coffee in front of her. She stared outside, eyes fixed on something far beyond the street view. Her face was pale, drawn, and marked by exhaustion, as though sleep had evaded her for days. When she noticed me entering, she gave a small, tentative wave. I walked over, carrying that same blend of dread and resolve that had taken root inside me the previous night. Jack? She asked softly, her voice barely audible. Yeah, I responded, lowering myself into the seat across from her. I attempted a smile, but it felt hollow. Thanks for meeting me. She nodded, her hands gripping the coffee cup like it was the only solid thing in her world. An uncomfortable silence followed, weighed down by everything we both knew and everything we had lost. I was at a loss for words. What could you possibly say to a stranger whose life had crumbled under the same deception that shattered yours? At last, Linda broke through the silence. You know, she began, her voice trembling slightly, when I discovered what was happening between David and Rachel, I thought I was losing my mind. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation, something less devastating. But the truth always finds its way out, doesn't it? I nodded slowly, struggling to steady my own voice. It really does, I said, then took a breath and decided not to hold back. Stacy told me about Rachel's past, about the affair from 7 years ago. I had no clue. Linda studied me for a moment, her eyes searching mine. Then a bitter laugh escaped her lips, followed by a weary shake of her head. I wish I could say I was shocked, Jack. But the moment I found out about Rachel, it was obvious this wasn't new for her. The way David spoke about her, the way she behaved, it was like she had perfected the act. She knew exactly how to pull him in, how to convince him she was his salvation. She paused, her gaze drifting down to the table. The pain etched in her expression was undeniable. David believed she was extraordinary. He said she got him in ways I no longer could. I don't think he ever truly understood how much he was sacrificing for someone who was simply playing a role. My jaw tensed as the resentment flared again, thinking about how coldly Rachel had discarded everything we built together, turning our lives into a stage for her twisted charade. She did the same to me, I said, my voice taut with restrained emotion. She actually brought David to our home. Told me she thought she loved him, right to my face. Like it meant nothing. Linda's eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears. She brought him to your house? Her voice was barely more than a whisper, horrified. I nodded, the fury tightening in my chest. She did. She stood there, acting like he was her latest trophy, expecting me to just accept it. The way she looked at me, like I was already history. Linda shut her eyes briefly, taking a shaky breath as she absorbed my words. I'm so sorry, Jack. No one should ever have to go through something like that. We sat quietly for a while, the silence wrapped around us, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with shared heartbreak, a silent acknowledgement of how our lives had been dismantled by the same hands. As I looked at Linda, at the rawness of her grief, it finally hit me. I wasn't alone. She had suffered just like I had. She had been deceived, discarded, and hurt by the same people who tore my world apart. Do you have any idea what you'll do next? She asked eventually, her words hushed and tentative. I shook my head slowly. I'm not sure. I admitted honestly. Part of me wants to burn everything down. Another part of me just wants to walk away and never look back. I guess I'm still trying to make sense of it all, I admitted, my voice trailing off. Linda gave a slow, sorrowful nod, a faint, wistful smile barely touching her lips. Yeah, I understand exactly how that feels. When I first found out about David, I seriously considered leaving him right then and there. But now, I just feel numb. It's like I've got no energy left to fight. Her words hung heavy in the air. He's trying, making promises, saying he wants to fix everything, but none of it feels real anymore. The words are hollow. The idea that Rachel might be attempting to make things right felt almost laughable. I could only picture her mocking the very suggestion of remorse or accountability. Rachel didn't even act like she was sorry, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from creeping into my voice. She behaved like I was the issue, like I was the reason she had to find someone else. Linda nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the floor. Isn't that always how they spin it? They flip the blame around until we're the ones who look responsible, like we somehow pushed them to it. But we didn't. This was their decision. Then she looked up, and something in her gaze had sharpened, clear, unwavering. She wasn't as broken as she had seemed earlier. They did this to us, Jack. We didn't cause it. And we can't let them keep taking from us. We deserve more than this. Her words pierced something deep within me, stirring a flicker of strength I hadn't felt in days. She was right. None of this had been my doing. I wasn't the one who had lied, who had betrayed everything we had built together. That weight belonged to Rachel and to David. They made their choices, and they would have to face the consequences. Drawing in a long breath, I gave a small nod. You're right. We do deserve better. We deserve people who are honest with us, people who actually care and wouldn't just look us in the eye while lying. Linda gave me another small smile, still sad, but this time touched with something that resembled hope. Maybe someday, we'll find that. Someone who really means it. We sat for a while after that, letting out our pain, swapping stories filled with heartbreak, rage, and disappointment. But as time passed, I began to feel something I hadn't in a long while, relief. Linda truly understood. She had lived through the same storm, experienced the same betrayal, and just talking with her made me feel less isolated. As I got up to leave, I glanced back at her. For the first time, something inside me stirred, a glimmer of what might one day be hope. Thanks for meeting up with me, Linda, and for listening. She nodded again, sadness still lingering in her eyes, but there was something new there too, strength. We're not alone in this, Jack. We'll make it through, no matter what. Stepping out into the cold, the air hit my face like a slap, bracing and real. I walked away from that little cafe with a new sense of purpose. Rachel had broken something in me, but I wouldn't let her walk away without facing the impact of her choices. As I reached my car, one thing had become crystal clear. I was done playing the role of the victim. The time had come to take control, to shape what came next. I was ready to release the woman who had shown me just how little I mattered to her. By the time I walked through my front door that night, something was already forming in my mind. A plan. I wasn't going to let Rachel just erase me without consequence. She had chosen her path. Now it was my turn to make choices of my own. She might have thought she could flaunt David in my face, mock everything we once had, and leave me broken in her wake. But I had no intention of letting that happen. As I stepped into the house, a strange silence greeted me, too quiet, like something had shifted. For a moment, I wondered if maybe Rachel had finally understood and left. But then, I caught the low murmur of voices coming from the living room. Hers. His. Still here. Whispering. Like two teenagers sneaking around, trying not to get caught. Anger bubbled up inside me as I moved closer, their words slowly becoming clearer. Rachel was speaking to David, her tone soft, coaxing. It's fine, David. He just needed to blow off some steam. He'll come around eventually. He always does. Those last words snapped something inside me. She thought she had me pegged. Thought I'd keep crawling back no matter how many times she stomped on my pride. That I'd keep settling for crumbs. Not this time. I swung the door open. Their heads turned instantly, both startled. Rachel's eyes widened for a moment, but then that familiar defiance crept back in. David, meanwhile, looked deeply uncomfortable, like he wanted to disappear into the furniture. He shuffled awkwardly beside her, clearly unsure of what to do. Jack, Rachel said, her voice laced with irritation. You're back already? I didn't answer her. My attention was fixed on David. My tone was calm but firm, final. You need to leave. Now. David hesitated, glancing to Rachel as if hoping for some kind of support, but she remained silent. Eventually, he gave a reluctant nod, muttering something inaudible before slipping out of the room. The sound of the front door closing behind him echoed through the space. Now it was just me and Rachel, facing each other in the living room that had once been the backdrop to so many cherished moments, game nights, slow Sunday mornings, laughter echoing through the walls. The house no longer felt like a home, it had turned into a battleground. Rachel stood there, arms crossed, her tone sharp with disbelief. Really, Jack? Is this how you're going to behave now? You said you were leaving. I stepped closer, refusing to avert my gaze. You seriously think you can bring that man into our home and I'm just going to walk away quietly? Do you believe you can twist our past and make it seem like I was the issue? No, Rachel. I'm not letting you walk away without facing the truth. She sneered, her expression filled with contempt. What are you even talking about? This is over. You and I were finished. I've moved on. David and I. You and David are ridiculous, I interrupted, my voice steady, cooled by a controlled rage. He's spineless, and you're making the same mistakes again and again. Stacy told me everything about the affair from 7 years ago, the one with the married man. This isn't new, Rachel. You've been down this road before. Don't pretend you were some helpless victim just looking for something more. You lied. You're tearing people apart. And for what? To feel like you're in control? Her face twisted with disbelief, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I didn't give her the space to recover. You don't get to act like this is my fault, I said, raising my voice. You can't stand there and pretend like I pushed you into this. These choices? They were yours. You brought that man into our home, snuck around behind my back, and now you're trying to dodge the consequences. Own what you've done. Anger flushed across her face. And you think you were perfect, Jack? Some amazing husband? She snapped. You were always distant, buried in your work. You made me feel invisible. I let out a bitter chuckle. And instead of trying to talk to me, instead of handling things like a grown-up, you ran, just like you always do. You replaced the emptiness with someone else. But here's the truth, Rachel. Happiness isn't something you find by running away. You'll keep lying to yourself, chasing illusions, and you'll never be satisfied. She stared at me, stunned, searching for a retort that never came. For a brief moment, her confident mask cracked, revealing something that looked eerily like fear. You're wrong, she murmured, her voice fragile. David loves me. He gets me. No, Rachel, I said quietly, stepping in closer but not softening entirely. He only sees the version of you that craves excitement and rescue. He doesn't know who you really are. And if you're honest with yourself, you know it too. Her eyes dropped to the floor as her arms slackened by her sides. She suddenly seemed small, like the truth of her actions had finally caught up to her. I took a breath, a calm spreading through me that I hadn't felt in weeks. The burden I'd been carrying didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was no longer mine to hold. I want you out of the house, I said, my voice calm and unshaken. Take whatever you need, but I expect you to be gone by tomorrow. I'm contacting a lawyer. This is done. She looked up, her eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite identify, fear, regret, maybe a faint spark of realization, but none of it changed anything. The damage had already been done. There was no reversing it now. Rachel didn't argue. She gave a small nod, almost unnoticeable, and quietly turned toward the stairs. I watched her ascend, feeling a hollow ache forming in my chest. This was how it ended, not how I ever imagined, but this was the truth I had to live with. As her footsteps faded upstairs, I stepped outside into the night. The air was cool, biting almost. David stood near his car, pale and visibly shaken when he spotted me. His lips parted, like he wanted to speak, but I didn't give him the opportunity. I walked straight past, got into my car, and drove off. It wasn't about Rachel anymore, or David. This was about reclaiming myself, finding a way to move forward, to finally release the weight that had been crushing me for far too long. As the road stretched out ahead, one thing became undeniably clear. I was going to be all right. Rachel had tried to tear everything apart, to break what we had built, but I had survived. I was still here. And now, I had the chance to rebuild, to find something genuine, something unbreakable, untouchable by betrayal. The next morning, I woke up in a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town. The sunlight filtered through the faded curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. For a fleeting, blissful moment, there was nothing, no sorrow, no anger, just a peaceful emptiness. But then reality came flooding back. Rachel, David, the betrayal that had wrecked everything I believed in. The room felt icy, a chill that crept into my bones, and I knew I couldn't remain there any longer. The moment had come to confront what lay ahead, the unavoidable tasks that needed handling. I drove back to the house in complete silence, my mind swirling with everything that had unfolded. What was waiting for me behind that front door? Would Rachel still be there, lingering like a storm cloud, ready to unleash another argument? Was there a chance David might be skulking nearby, desperate to prove something that no longer mattered? My grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles pale with tension, as I prepared myself for whatever the morning held. Pulling into the driveway, my eyes were immediately drawn to the vacant spot where Rachel's car used to sit. It hit me, a strange, hollow sensation, as if something essential had been yanked away, leaving only an echo in its place. The front door was slightly ajar. As I stepped inside, a heavy stillness wrapped around me. It wasn't just the absence of Rachel that I felt. It was as though the soul of the home had vanished with her. The warmth, the memories we had built together, all seemed to have evaporated overnight. Only a few signs of her remained. Near the entryway were a few cardboard boxes, loosely packed with clothes, books, and miscellaneous items she hadn't bothered to fully take. I didn't care to inspect them. Exhaling slowly, I made my way to the living room and froze. Sitting squarely on the table was an envelope. My name was written across it in Rachel's distinct handwriting. A letter. A note, left behind like the rest of her things. A lump formed in my stomach as I reached for it. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash unopened, but curiosity had other plans. The sound of paper tearing seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the house. I unfolded the note and stared at the neatly written words. Jack, I know there's nothing I can say that will fix what I've done. I never meant to hurt you, though I understand now how meaningless that must sound. Maybe some part of me thought I could live two lives without causing damage, but I see now how naive and selfish that was. I won't ask for your forgiveness, because I don't believe I deserve it. I'm sorry for the lies, the betrayal, for not having the courage to be honest sooner. I hope that someday you might understand why I made the choices I did, even if forgiveness never comes. Rachel. I crushed the paper in my hand, the weight of her words refusing to fully register. Understand why she did it? The audacity of that hope nearly made me scoff out loud. This wasn't about understanding. This was about her shattering everything we'd built together for what? A moment of excitement? A taste of something different? I let the letter fall, landing on top of the boxes she'd abandoned. That was her idea of closure, a handful of vague sentiments, a hollow excuse disguised as remorse. There was no comfort in it, no peace. Just more reminders of what she destroyed. I turned my back on it all. I wouldn't give her any more of my energy. She was gone. That was final. Now that Rachel was no longer part of my life, the reality of the situation came into sharp focus. Legal matters, joint finances, shared belongings, everything that once bound us needed unraveling. It was overwhelming, imagining the effort it would take to separate two lives so deeply intertwined. But underneath that dread was a spark of relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of clarity, like I was beginning to reclaim a version of myself that had been dormant. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number of a divorce attorney I had heard positive things about. My finger hovered over the call button, hesitation knotting my stomach. This call would make it official. There would be no going back, no hidden path to reconciliation, no illusion of repair. But that illusion had already crumbled the day Rachel brought David into our lives. With a steady breath, I pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear. The ringing echoed through the empty space until a polished, professional voice answered. I introduced myself and explained my situation, keeping my words distant, as if describing someone else's story. The lawyer listened carefully, asking a few follow-up questions. By the time I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of relief. This was the right decision. I couldn't linger in the past, clinging to fragments of a life that no longer existed. It was time to move forward, to begin rebuilding something that was truly my own, without the weight of betrayal, without Rachel. I spent the remainder of the day gathering the last of her things, tossing clothes into boxes without a second thought to neatness. I moved with purpose, fueled by the need to cleanse the house of her presence. When I finished, the living room was filled with labeled boxes, each one a container of what used to be our shared life, now neatly organized for removal. I contacted a moving company and arranged for them to pick up the boxes and deliver them to her new address. Rachel never shared her destination with me, but Stacy had filled in the gaps. Somehow, it felt fitting. Rachel leaving without saying goodbye, and me, the one left behind, handling all the final details. That night, after the final box was loaded into the moving truck and it pulled away into the darkness, I lingered at the doorway, watching the taillights disappear. The house was mine again, silent, vacant, and waiting for a new beginning. I stepped back inside and gently closed the door behind me. For the first time in what felt like ages, a sense of calm began to settle over me. The shadows held no more secrets, and there were no hidden truths left to uncover. Rachel was out of my life, and yet I remained, standing firm, still present, and finally prepared to move on. I made my way to the kitchen, pulled a beer from the fridge, and sank into the couch. My gaze drifted out the window to the night sky above. The quiet that filled the room wasn't a reminder of loss anymore. It had transformed into a symbol of potential, of what I might rebuild on my own terms. This was my life now, and for once, it felt like mine to shape. Linda crossed my mind. Her expression during our conversation at the cafe, a complex mix of determination and sorrow. We'd both been hurt, both abandoned in the aftermath of someone else's choices. Yet we were still here, carrying on. Perhaps now, we each had a chance to create something genuine, something real. I took a slow sip of beer, the crisp coldness a sharp contrast to the warmth slowly blooming in my chest. I couldn't predict what was ahead, whether love would ever find its way back to me, or even if I would seek it again. But one thing was clear, I was free. Free from the deception, from the heavy burden of a marriage that had fractured long before I was ready to see it. That freedom no longer scared me. It felt like the start of something entirely new, something that I could shape from the ground up. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. Not for Rachel, not for what we had lost, but for myself, for the person I could still become and the life I had yet to live. The path ahead stretched wide, and I was finally ready to walk it. Within a week, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. I painted over the old walls and replaced the worn-out couch Rachel had loved with a sleek, modern piece that felt more like me. I purchased new kitchenware, swapped the bedding, and threw away her collection of decorative pillows. Each change, however small, marked a clear step away from our shared past. It felt like a personal transformation, therapeutic in a way. The more I changed, the more the house began to reflect who I was becoming, rather than what I had left behind. I had just finished painting the guest room a cool, calming shade of blue when I heard a knock at the door. Glancing at the clock, I wiped my hands on a nearby rag, confused. I wasn't expecting company, especially not this late. For a moment, I wondered if Rachel had come back to stir up more trouble, but I quickly dismissed the thought. She was far too proud to return after everything that had unfolded. When I opened the door, the person standing there wasn't Rachel, it was David. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, like sleep had eluded him for days. He stood on the doorstep with his hands buried in his pockets, saying nothing at first, just staring at me like he wasn't sure why he'd even come. A surge of anger rose within me, my jaw tightened. This was the man who had taken Rachel from me, the same man who had once stood in my living room with a hollow sense of entitlement and looked at me with quiet pity. Finally, he broke the silence. "Jack," he said, voice rough and low, "can we talk?" Every part of me wanted to shut the door in his face, to tell him he had no right to be here, and that I never wanted to see him again. But there was something different in his expression, something hollow, fragile. He looked like someone who had just watched his world collapse. And strangely, I found myself curious. Maybe I needed to hear him out. I stepped aside just slightly, leaving the door cracked open enough for him to enter. After a pause, he crossed the threshold, glancing nervously around the room like he expected Rachel to be hiding somewhere. I led him to the living room, where we stood in silence, the atmosphere thick with unease. "What do you want, David?" I asked flatly, unwilling to offer any warmth. He swallowed hard, the movement visible in his throat. Then he finally spoke. "Rachel left me," he said, and his voice trembled. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw something raw behind them, something close to regret. "She left 2 days ago," he continued. "Just packed up her stuff and walked out. She didn't even say goodbye." I stared at him, anger now tinged with disbelief. Rachel had walked away from him too? After all she destroyed to be with him, she had just vanished? "Why are you telling me this, David?" I asked, trying to rein in the confusion bubbling beneath the surface. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair and let out a shaky breath. "Because I don't know what else to do," he admitted. "She's gone, Jack. She used me, just like she used you. I thought she cared. I thought we were building something real. But once everything around us crumbled, she just moved on like none of it mattered. I couldn't stop the reaction. A dry, bitter laugh escaped me, echoing through the silence of the room. What exactly did you expect me to say, David? My voice was edged with disbelief. You thought I'd feel bad for you? That I'd step in and help you rebuild after everything? I shook my head slowly, anger beginning to surge through me once again, ignited by the sheer nerve he had to stand there and ask for sympathy. You wrecked my marriage, David. You walked into my life, into my home, and took something that was never yours to begin with. And now, because she's done to you what you both did to me, I'm supposed to lend a hand. My words hit him hard. His expression twisted with pain, and for a fleeting second, I thought he might actually break down. I know I don't deserve anything from you, he muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. I know I made a mess of everything. I had to say it. I needed someone to understand. She didn't just betray you, Jack. She hurt me too. I kept my gaze fixed on him, frustration still pulsing under my skin, yet something else began to rise, an uncomfortable sense of shared pain. He wasn't lying. Rachel had manipulated us both, using us like pieces in a game only she understood. And when she'd finished, she walked away without hesitation or remorse. A long breath left me as I tried to ease the tension in my shoulders. What exactly did you think was going to happen, David? My tone softened, though the sting of disdain remained. Did you really think she'd change? That she'd suddenly become someone entirely different, just for you? David lowered his head and shook it slowly. I don't know, he whispered. I guess I convinced myself we were something special. That she actually cared. Exhausted, I rubbed my face with one hand, the emotional weight of the last week pressing down on me. Rachel doesn't love anyone, David. Not truly. She's in love with the idea of being adored. She craves the excitement of pursuit. But once she gets what she's chasing, she loses interest. That's just how she is. He looked up at me then, eyes filled with a sorrow I instantly recognized. It mirrored the emptiness I had once felt. So what now? He asked, barely audible. How do I move forward from this? I studied him carefully, the same man who once played a role in dismantling everything I held dear. But in that moment, I didn't see a rival anymore. He was just another casualty of Rachel's selfishness. Another life altered by her whims. You put the pieces back together, I said at last, my voice weary. You start from the ground up. You learn the lesson and don't let it define who you become. Moving on is the only way forward, David. He nodded slowly, his eyes moist with tears he refused to let fall. I'm sorry, Jack, he murmured. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I truly am. I wish I could undo what happened. I gave him a small nod, though I couldn't bring myself to respond aloud. Maybe one day forgiveness would come. Maybe the anger would lose its grip, and I'd be able to look at him without seeing betrayal. But today wasn't that day. You should leave now, I said, stepping aside to open the door. He nodded again, swiping at his face before slipping out in silence, the soft click of the door closing behind him echoing in the quiet. I remained standing, letting the silence settle like dust around me. His unexpected visit had reopened wounds I believed were already healing. Yet somehow it also brought a strange form of closure. Rachel was gone, and so was the power she held over either of us. The chains were broken. Returning to the living room, I looked around at the space I had slowly reshaped. Every change I had made spoke of new beginnings. And in that moment, I realized something deeply important. I no longer needed anything from Rachel. Not her remorse, not her justifications, not even a final word. I was free. And for the first time, I genuinely believed it. As the days blended into weeks, life seemed to decelerate in a way that I could finally embrace. I no longer braced for the next disaster, the next deception, or the exhausting battle to hold together something broken beyond repair. The focus shifted to my own path, untangled, unburdened, and fully mine. I began doing things simply because they brought me peace. I'd visit the local park with a book in hand, nestling beneath the shade of a grand oak tree, immersing myself in stories far removed from my own. I started going to the gym more regularly, pushing my body with long runs that left my heart pounding, not from fury, but from feeling truly alive. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from during the chaos Rachel brought into my life. And they welcomed me back with open arms, free of judgment, as if no time had passed. Being around them felt like breathing fresh air after spending years in a stifling room. Even the house itself began to reflect the change. I took down the photographs that had once captured moments with Rachel and replaced them with bold, abstract art that sparked hope and imagination rather than memories I no longer wished to hold on to. I transformed the guest bedroom into a personal art studio, complete with an easel and a fresh canvas. It had been years since college, in fact, since I last picked up a paintbrush. The process was far from perfect, often messy, but it felt like mine, and that was all that really mattered. One quiet morning, I was sitting in the living room, coffee in hand, sunlight spilling gently through the curtains, when my phone lit up with a message. Expecting a casual note from a friend, or perhaps something work-related, I glanced at the screen. But it wasn't what I anticipated. It was a message from Linda. "Hey Jack, I've been thinking, would you want to grab a coffee sometime? Just to catch up." My eyes lingered on her words for a moment before a soft smile took over my face. Although we hadn't spoken in weeks, Linda had never been far from my thoughts. Our last conversation had left a mark, built on shared pain and understanding. What we had wasn't the kind of romantic connection you'd see in a film. It was something more profound, rooted in truth and resilience. We had both survived something shattering and emerged on the other side not just intact but stronger. I typed back quickly, "I love that. How about this weekend?" Her response came fast, a warm "sounds perfect," followed by a smiley face that strangely lifted my spirits more than I expected. It was a small gesture, yet it felt like the beginning of something new, something honest. When Saturday arrived, I found myself unusually jittery. I reminded myself this wasn't a date. It was simply coffee between two people who had weathered storms and come out still standing. But as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my shirt, trying not to look too casual, I realized that this meeting mattered more to me than I had admitted. We met at a small downtown cafe, cozy, filled with mismatched chairs and a kind of inviting warmth. Linda was already seated at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug. When she spotted me, her smile widened and her voice carried a light, relieved tone. "Jack, I'm really glad you came." Taking a seat across from her, I returned her smile. "Of course. It's good to see you too, Linda." We started by catching up on the surface-level stuff, work, hobbies, the books on our nightstands. Conversation flowed effortlessly, and soon I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Linda had this dry humor I hadn't noticed before, and when she talked about her favorite things, cooking, hiking, and the art classes she'd taken up, her eyes sparkled with joy. Inevitably, our talk circled back to Rachel and David. But now, it didn't sting the way it once had. It felt like looking back on something distant, a closed chapter. The weight of it no longer clung to us. "How are you doing, really?" Linda asked gently, her gaze sincere and full of care. I paused for a moment, then nodded slowly, a soft smile creeping in. "I'm okay. Actually, I think I'm better than okay. It's weird, but I feel kind of free." Her face relaxed, and she mirrored my smile. "Me too. It's like I can finally breathe again. It still hurts sometimes, but not in the same way. It's not something I carry with me every moment anymore." We let the silence sit with us then, comfortable and easy, both sipping our drinks and sharing the stillness. I looked at her, and it dawned on me, maybe healing wasn't some dramatic epiphany or a grand moment of joy. Maybe it was this, quiet, simple, and shared with someone who truly understood. "Jack?" she asked suddenly, her voice unsure. "Do you ever wonder what's next? For you, I mean." I met her eyes and saw the quiet question hiding there. Reaching out, I gently touched her hand, fingers brushing hers, just a small touch, yet it felt like a step forward. "I'm not sure what's next," I admitted, "but I think I'd like to figure it out, one step at a time." Her hand curled softly around mine, and in that instant, something shifted inside me. It wasn't love, at least, not yet, but it was something meaningful, something steady. It felt like the beginning of a new path, one I could walk at my own pace. We stayed at the cafe through the afternoon, sharing stories, laughter, and fragments of who we were. By the time we stepped outside, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. I walked her to her car, and just before she left, she paused and looked back. "Jack," she said quietly, "I'm really glad we're going through this together." A warmth spread through my chest as I smiled. "Me too, Linda." She gave me one last look, full of gentle gratitude, then got in her car and drove away. I stood there, watching her taillights disappear down the street. The air had turned cool, the sky darkened, and I breathed in deeply, feeling calm settle over me. Rachel had tried to destroy me, had tried to take everything I was and leave me with nothing, but she hadn't succeeded. I remained, unmoved yet resilient, ready to take the next step, and this time, I wasn't facing it on my own. As I made my way back to the car, a wave of hope washed over me, a feeling I had kept buried for far too long. The weight of the past had finally begun to lift, and the road ahead, no matter what it might bring, felt like it belonged to me. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I experienced a sense of real freedom.